The Smoker by David Schickler is read by Robert Sean Leonard.
Douglas Kerchak taught 12th grade advanced placement English at St. Agnes High School on West 97th and Broadway. Nicole Bonner was the standout girl in his class. She was the tallest at 5'10". She was the oldest at 19 and the smartest with a flawless A. She wasn't the prettiest, Douglas thought, not beside the spunky nose of Rhonda Phelps or Meredith Beckerman's heart-shaped derriere. But Nicole was dangerously alluring. She had a chopped black Cleopatra haircut and wise blue eyes, and her recent essay on Othello had ended with this note. Dear Mr. Kerchak, last night in bed, I read Fear and Loathing in LV. It is puerile, self-involved gamesmanship. I suppose I don't love drugs enough, although my parents make me drink brandy with them every night. They consider it a gesture of affection. I saw you yesterday, outside the locker room, changing your shoes to go running, and your ankle looked quite blue. What did you bang it on? Respectfully, Nicole Bonner. This note caused Douglas some concern. He himself disliked Hunter S. Thompson, but Nicole had also written in bed and mentioned his bruise. It was Nicole's habit to do this, to call out random, intimate specifics from the world around her and bring them to Douglas's attention. She'd done it that day in class. Iago is filled with lust, Mr. Kerchak, said Jill Eckert. He's a Machiavellian bastard, said Rhonda Phelps. You know what's an excellent word to say out loud repeatedly? Nicole Bonner chewed her hair. Rinse. Think about it, Mr. Kerchak. Rinse. Rinse. That evening, as always, Douglas walked home to his shabby studio apartment. Douglas was 31. He lived alone, 5 blocks north of St. Agnes, in an apartment building filled with Mexican men who drank Pabst and had boisterous poker games every night in the lobby outside Douglas's first-floor apartment. Their nickname for Douglas was Uno, because whenever he sat with them, he had one quiet beer and bowed out. Uno, cackled the Mexicans. Come take our money, Uno. A 12-year-old boy named Chiapas rattled a beer can. Come get your medicine, Uno. Douglas grinned wanly, waved them off, keyed his door open. Rinse, he thought, frowning. Rinse. Rinse. After a quick sandwich, Douglas corrected essays. He was a tough grader, and he had short black sideburns with streaks of gray in them. He also had a boxer's build and a Harvard PhD in English literature and no wife or girlfriend. All of these qualities made Douglas a font of intrigue for the all-female population of St. Agnes, both the lay faculty and the students. But in truth, Douglas led a sedentary life. He loved books. He was a passionate, solitary filmgoer. And he got his hair cut every 4 weeks by Chiapas, whose father ran a barbershop down the block. All told, Douglas was a quiet, and he thought, happy man. He was also the only male teacher at St. Agnes. Cheryl, Audrey, and Katya, the 3 single women on the faculty, would have taken up the crusade of dating him, but he wasn't drawn to his coworkers. Cheryl wore electric shades of suede that confused him. Audrey had 2 cops for ex-husbands, and Katya, despite her long legs and Lithuanian accent, was cruel to the girls. So Douglas spent his nights alone, seeing films, correcting essays, and occasionally chatting with Chiapas and company. On this particular night, Douglas was barely into his stack of essays when the telephone rang. Hello, sighed Douglas. He expected it to be his mother, who called weekly from Pennsylvania to see if her son had become miraculously engaged. Good evening, Mr. Kerchak. Douglas frowned. Nicole? Yes, sir. How did you get this number? Off the Rolodex in the principal's office, how's your ankle? Douglas sneezed twice. He did this instinctively when he didn't know what to say. God bless you, said Nicole. Thank you, said Douglas. He glanced around as if expecting his apartment suddenly to fill with students. How's your ankle? It's all right. I banged it on my radiator. Really? The truth was, Douglas had slipped in his shower like an elderly person. Yes, really, Nicole. Do you know what's happening to my ankle as we converse? No. John Stapleton is licking it. He likes to nibble my toes, too. Douglas blinked several times. John Stapleton is a domestic shorthair. Sometimes he licks, other times he nibbles. I see, said Douglas. There was a substantial pause. John Stapleton is a cat, said Nicole. Of course, agreed Douglas. Do you enjoy gnocchi? Douglas set his essays on the couch beside him. Pardon? Gnocchi. Italian potato dumplings. We had them for dinner tonight. Father makes them by hand every Thursday. It's the only thing Father cooks, but he's good at it. Douglas crossed his ankle over his knee. So, do you enjoy them? Gnocchi. Yes. Yes. Yes meaning you enjoy them, or yes meaning you understood what I was asking? Yes. I mean, yes. I like them. Nicole Bonner laughed. When should I start hearing from colleges? She asked. It's nearly April. Douglas was relieved at the topic. Any week now, but you'll get in anywhere. It's all about what you want. I want Princeton. Douglas imagined Nicole sitting on a dorm bed, reading, sipping soup. He imagined baggy sweater sleeves covering her wrists. Did you know that John Stapleton is toilet trained? Douglas laughed out loud. Once. This usually only happened at the movies, if he was alone and the film was absurd. Toilet trained, meaning what? Meaning that he uses the toilet, like a human being. He crouches on the rim of the bowl and does his business and presses his paw on the flusher afterwards. He's very tidy. Nicole, said Douglas, it's the truth, sir. It took Father eons to train him, but he did it. We don't even have a litter box. Father was a Marine. Douglas checked his watch. John Stapleton's an unusual name for a cat. He's an unusual cat, said Nicole. I think maybe I should hang up now, Nicole. Why don't we talk in school tomorrow? All right, I don't want to inconvenience you in your evening time. It's all right. Really? Well, what I mean is it's no problem, but we'll talk in school tomorrow. Inevitably, said Nicole, and she hung up. Douglas had written Nicole a letter of recommendation for Princeton. In the letter, he'd said this: whether she's tearing across the field hockey grass, debunking Whitman, or lecturing me about Woody Allen films, Nicole exudes an irrepressible spirit and a generous, unguarded tenacity. She reads an entire novel every night, not to impress anyone, but because she loves to do it. She is organized, clever, and kind-hearted, and once she knows what she wants, she will pursue a thing. A line of argument, a hockey ball, a band to hire for the prom, with a charmingly ruthless will. Douglas prided himself on such recommendations, on making his students shine on paper. It was one of the few vanities he allowed himself. When it came to crafting words, written or spoken, Douglas felt that he'd been blessed with a knack for always knowing what to say. That was why, the morning after his call from Nicole, Douglas awoke feeling flummoxed. He'd spent 10 minutes on the phone with a 19-year-old girl and tripped over his tongue the whole time. During the night, he'd also dreamed he'd been walking barefoot down a beach with Nicole. In the dream, she wore a lowrider black bikini and a lovely blue scarf in her hair like Jackie Kennedy. Douglas, meanwhile, wore green Toughskins jeans and a shirt made of burlap. Every time the waves washed over their feet, Douglas scampered back and yelled, "Beware the manatees!" It's ridiculous, thought Douglas. Embarrassing. He put on a smart coat and tie and decided to give the girls a pop quiz that day. At school in the faculty lounge, Douglas forced himself to make small talk with Cheryl, the suede-clad mathematician. When the bell for his AP class rang, Douglas strode into his classroom with confidence. "Mr. Kerchak?" Meredith Beckerman jumped from her desk. "Jill's going to ask you to come watch softball today, but you promised to see our forensics meet against Regis. Do you remember?" "I remember," said Douglas. "Suck up," Jill told Meredith. Meredith glared at Jill. "Avaunt and quit my sight." She sniffed. Douglas surveyed the room. His AP class consisted of 6 girls, the brightest lights in the St. Agnes senior class. They were Meredith and Jill, the arguers, Rhonda Phelps, the bombshell achiever, Kelly Demers, the agnostic, Nancy Huck, who was always on vacation, and Nicole Bonner, who sat by the window. "Where's Nancy?" asked Douglas. "Bermuda," said Rhonda, "snorkeling with her aunt." Jill tapped her Othello script. "Can we discuss the last act?" "Desdemona's a dipshit," said Meredith. "Meredith," warned Douglas. He glanced at Nicole, then Kelly. They spoke the least of the 6. Kelly because she was cultivating spiritual fatigue. And Nicole because, well, thought Douglas, because she was Nicole. The look in her eyes when she stared out the window reminded Douglas of when he was a boy and he would gaze at his mother's dressing room mirror, wondering who lived on the other side. "Vocab quiz," said Douglas. The girls whipped out pens and blank pieces of paper. 3 synonyms from Latin roots for bellicose, Douglas thought out loud. 2 antonyms for abstruse. 1 example of synecdoche. Extra credit, list 4 books by Melville. You have 5 minutes. The girls began writing immediately. Douglas watched them with fondness. They were gifted young women, and they would all conquer this class, every literature class of their futures. He passed among them, staring at their bent heads, at the roots of their hair and their earlobes, wondering how many had prom dates, how many might end up teachers, how quickly Rhonda would marry. He rolled his eyes at Meredith and Jill's papers. Each of them already had 7 synonyms for bellicose. Kelly was finished in 3 minutes and was now drawing hangman nooses, her trademark on all her letter T's. Then Douglas looked over Nicole's shoulder. Nicole's paper was in a band of sunlight, and on it she had written no vocabulary words whatsoever. She was, however, busily churning out sentences. Douglas watched, then caught his breath. Nicole had written, verbatim, from memory, the entire first page to Moby Dick, and was still going. Douglas waited to see if she would run out of steam or turn her head to look at him, but she didn't. He tried to recall if he or any other teacher at St. Agnes had ever asked the girls to memorize and recite Melville, but he knew this wasn't the case. He leaned down. He could smell Nicole's raspberry shampoo. He scribbled in the margin of her paper, "This isn't what I asked for." Without glancing up, Nicole crossed out what he'd set down and wrote, "It is a far, far better thing that I'll do." "Pens down," said Douglas. After school, he performed his daily regimen. Half an hour of free weights followed by a 3-mile run in Central Park. He got back to St. Agnes with just enough time for a shower before the forensics match. Outside the locker room, though, lounging on her back on a windowsill 8 feet off the ground was Nicole Bonner. "How did you get up there?" panted Douglas. He was winded from his run. "Flew." Nicole sat up, studied her teacher. Douglas had a privileged view of her ankles, which were crossed and not at all blue. She wore low black pumps. "What did you read last night?" he asked. "The Moviegoer" by Walker Percy. "Did you know, Mr. Kerchak, that thousands of runners die every year from heart attacks in mid-workout?" "I don't think I run fast enough to induce cardiac trauma, Nicole." The girl on the ledge didn't swish her legs. "Trauma's an excellent word to say out loud repeatedly. Trauma. Trauma." "I should shower," said Douglas. Nicole pointed at him. "Give me one good reason why I should go to college at all." "Tons of reading time," said Douglas. Nicole jumped off the ledge, landed lightly on her feet a yard from Douglas. "I'll accept that," she said. Without any goodbye, she turned and walked away. It was 3 weeks later, in mid-April, that Douglas received the invitation. It happened on a rainy Tuesday at the start of the school morning. Just before chapel, Nicole poked her head in the faculty lounge where Douglas and Katya Zaroff sat beside each other on the couch. Douglas was reading the paper, and Katya had just noticed a ladder in her stockings. "Mr. Kerchak," said Nicole. Douglas and Katya looked up. "No students in here," said Katya. "Mr. Kerchak, I need to speak to you privately." Nicole stood with her hands behind her back. She wore her school uniform and a silver bracelet with jade dolphins on it. Douglas stood. Katya Zaroff made a little snort. Out in the hall, Nicole flashed Douglas a smile. "Princeton's taking me," she said. Douglas had a fleeting image of hugging his student. He patted her once on the shoulder. "That's wonderful," he said. "Congratulations." Nicole nodded sharply. She had a Bible under one arm, which surprised Douglas. "As a thank you for your letter of recommendation, my parents and I would like you to join us for dinner this Thursday in our home." "Well," said Douglas, "that's very kind, but there's no need. We'll be serving gnocchi that Father will have prepared by hand. I've assured Father that you enjoy gnocchi." "Nicole," began Douglas. The bell rang for chapel. "You told me that you enjoy gnocchi, Mr. Kerchak." "Oh, I do," said Douglas quickly. "But listen, Nicole, I'm very proud that you've gotten into Princeton, but you don't have to." "I'm reading the book of Revelation." Nicole tapped the Bible, in case you were wondering. Girls surged past Douglas and Nicole, chattering, chapel-bound. "Come on, Nicky," said Rhonda Phelps. "Good morning, Mr. Kerchak," said Audrey Little, the horny health teacher. Nicole cocked her head to one side. "Did you know, Mr. Kerchak, that there are creatures in the book of Revelation covered entirely with eyeballs?" Douglas shook his head. He felt slightly dizzy, in need of ibuprofen. "My parents and I will expect you at 7 on Thursday." Nicole stepped backwards. "We live in the Preemption apartment building, West 82nd and Riverside." "Preemption?" called Douglas, but Nicole Bonner had turned away. On Thursday afternoon, Douglas got his hair cut at the corner barbershop. Chiapas, who wasn't 5 feet tall yet, stood on a milk crate, moving an electric razor over Douglas's sideburns, grinning at Douglas in the mirror. "You a week early, Uno? Hot date tonight?" Douglas smirked. "Yeah, right." Chiapas whistled a tune Douglas didn't know. Because Chiapas was only an apprentice, Douglas got his haircuts for free. "Bet you got a date, Uno. Bet you and Grace Kelly going out for langostino." "Uh-huh." Chiapas knew Douglas's movie addictions. "Ow!" Douglas flinched, and Chiapas pulled the razor away. Douglas turned his head, 2 inches below his part. The razor had bitten his hair down to the scalp. "Oops." Chiapas shrugged. "Sorry, Uno." Chiapas fingered the gash. "Chiapas, today of all days." The boy's eyes lit up. "You do got a date." Douglas blushed. "I do not." Chiapas inspected Douglas's head. The cutaway hair was in the shape of a question mark, without the period. "Don't worry, Uno, it's cool. She'll love it." "There is no she," insisted Douglas. At 7 p.m., Douglas arrived at the Preemption apartment building. He wore a camel's hair sports coat, and he carried a German chocolate cake from Café Mozart. He'd thought first to bring wine, then decided it was inappropriate since Nicole was his student. In the lobby, Douglas was met by a tall, black doorman with an oval scar on his forehead. "Douglas Kerchak," said the doorman. "This way." Douglas followed the doorman to an ancient Otis elevator, the hand-operated kind. "Top floor, penthouse." The doorman ushered Douglas into the elevator, pulled a lever, and stepped out. Bon chance. The elevator doors closed and Douglas was alone, moving. He glanced around himself. The elevator was antiquated, with mahogany walls that smelled like something Douglas couldn't quite place. A medieval monk's library, maybe, or the inside of a coffin. When he disembarked the elevator, the door to the Bonner penthouse was already open. Nicole stood leaning against the jamb. Good evening, Mr. Kerchak. Douglas made an effort not to widen his eyes. Nicole was wearing the most exquisite black silk evening gown he'd ever seen. It lay along the lines and curves of her body in a fashion so perfectly tailored that the material might have been woven around her as she stood there in the doorway. The gown was exactly as black as her hair, and for a fantastic second, Douglas imagined that crushed black diamonds and the ink of several squids had gone into making silk. "Hello, Nicole," said Douglas. "You look really nice." "You have a question mark on your head," said Nicole. Douglas sneezed twice. Nicole blessed him. A man and a woman appeared behind her. "My parents," said Nicole, not looking at them. "Samson," announced the man. "Paulette," smiled the woman. "Douglas Kerchak," said Douglas. Samson Bonner resembled a gigantic bass instrument. He was well over 6 feet tall, and although his torso sloped forward toward the abdomen, it appeared to be formidably muscled. His voice was resoundingly deep, almost a shout, and his eyes were black. He was a renowned lawyer of unwavering conservative politics. His wife, Paulette, was as skinny and straight as a flute. The teacher, chirped Paulette. Come in, come in." They all moved inside. Samson Bonner shut the door. Paulette whisked Douglas's cake box off to another room. "Cocktails!" boomed Samson. Douglas looked around. The Bonner penthouse was the kind of lair that nefarious urbanites like Lex Luthor occupied in films. The huge main room had a high ceiling and a marble floor. Lining one entire wall were shelves bearing leather-bound tomes that, for all Douglas knew, could be traced to the same monk's library he'd smelled in the elevator. Also in the room were 2 hunter green couches, a hearth with a fire, a glass table laid for dinner, an oaken door that opened into a study, and 3 tall windows. Through these, Manhattan could be seen, laid out like a map on which schemes were planned. Douglas guessed that the exterior dormers of these windows held gargoyles, and he was right. Paulette Bonner swept back into view, carrying a tray of glasses and a cocktail shaker. "Sidecars, sidecars." Paulette set the tray on an end table by the couches. "We're a brandy family, Douglas," said Samson. "We have a gusto for brandy." "Ho, ho," said Douglas. He'd meant it to sound chipper and hail, but it didn't. Drinks were doled out. The women sat on one couch, the men on the other. Samson Bonner wore a fine, bone-colored suit. His wife, who had black hair like Nicole's, wore a gray dress. The fire cackled. Douglas sipped his drink, which tasted like limes. In his hometown, Allentown, Pennsylvania, very few drinks contained limes. "I'm so proud of Nicole," said Douglas. You must be too." We are, breathed Paulette. "Well, hell," Samson Bonner punched Douglas on the shoulder. "Just because Princeton has a white boy hoop club doesn't mean they can't compete. Am I wrong?" "No," said Douglas, whose shoulder now hurt. "So they're pick and roll. So they're old school backdoor. So what?" "We're so pleased you've come," said Paulette. Douglas glanced back and forth between the parents. Despite their bookshelves, he couldn't tell yet whether they were literary, like their daughter. "How's your sidecar, Mr. Kerchak?" said Nicole. "It's brandy and Cointreau," explained Paulette. "And limes!" shouted Samson. Douglas smiled and nodded. "Anyway," said Samson, "let's hear from the man." He patted Douglas's back. A silence happened. Douglas grinned around foolishly until it hit him. What, you mean me? Sure you, bellowed Samson. Absolutely you! The Bonners sat waiting, looking at Douglas. Well, Douglas scratched his recently botched head. What would you like to hear about? Hell, we don't know, Samson har-harred. You want to hear about me, that I'm from Pennsylvania, that kind of thing? Douglas looked at Nicole. No, said Samson, teach us something. Yes, Paulette's eyes flashed. Teach us something, said Samson, or else no gnocchi for you. Douglas laughed. No one joined him. Father's serious, Mr. Kerchak. Nicole peered over the top of her glass at her teacher. He gets like this. You have to teach him and my mother something or the evening can't progress. Douglas gazed at his student. He saw that she was in earnest, then looked quickly away. Nicole's hair was pulled back taut to her head tonight, and Douglas feared that if he stared too long at the taper of her temples, her father, the Marine, would notice. What would you like to learn? Hell, we're easy. Samson punched Douglas again. Teach them a word, suggested Nicole. Something quick, I'm hungry. Douglas moved to the edge of the couch, out of Samson's fist range. He thought of things he knew well. He thought of books. I suppose, said Douglas, I could tell you why I think Shakespeare named King Lear, King Lear. Paulette looked anxious, as if Douglas were in peril. Lear is the German word for empty, and King Lear is an existential play. The title character ends up mad, out in the wilderness, living in a hovel like Job. He's a man stripped down, all alone with the truth of himself. Douglas raised his eyebrows. An empty man. Bravo! Shouted Samson. He jabbed toward Douglas's shoulder, but Douglas stood up quickly. He poured himself a fresh sidecar. Empty, empty. Paulette sounded delighted. Nicole narrowed her eyes. You never taught us that. What? Said Douglas. We read King Lear last November. You never taught us about the German, about the name. Douglas shrugged. He set down the cocktail shaker. Well, it's just a theory I have. It's nothing proven. Wrong! Douglas pointed at Douglas. It's the truth! I know the truth when I hear it. Well, it's the truth, and you found it. Samson gave Douglas the thumbs up. The evening can progress. Nicole stood. I think it's damn selfish. That's what I think. She glared at Douglas. What is? Said Douglas. You, sneered Nicole. You keeping your precious little theory all secret from your students. Now, wait a minute, said Douglas. No. Nicole crossed her arms under her breasts in a manner that Douglas could not ignore. You're our teacher, Mr. Kerchak. You're supposed to lay bare your thoughts on behalf of us girls. Looks like he kept some thoughts for himself. Samson winked. It's just a theory, emphasized Douglas. Nicole raised her chin, which made Douglas see her neck, the shadowy knife of her cleavage. I am absolutely disappointed, she said icily, and I will not speak again tonight until the salad course. Nicole, said Douglas, but Nicole left the couch and took her place at the table. Samson rubbed his hands together. Let's eat, he cried. During the shrimp cocktail appetizer, Douglas related much of his life to the Bonners. He was nervous because Nicole was moody and silent, and he ended up blurting the stories of his postgraduate year in Japan, his bout with mononucleosis, his disastrous senior prom with Heather Angelona. You're feeling all right now, though, said Samson. Douglas looked up from his salad. Sir? You're recovered, I mean, from the mono. Oh, yes, sir. I had it 13 years ago. Bravo! Samson wolfed down a chunk of cucumber. Look, no more of this sir business. I'm Samson, damn it! All right, Douglas tried to catch Nicole's eye. She sat across from him while Samson and Paulette sat at the long ends of the table. When Nicole only stared into her salad, Douglas switched his gaze to the book wall behind her. "So, Samson," said Douglas, "Paulette, those are wonderfully bound books there. Have you read most of them?" Samson stared hard at Douglas. He let 10 seconds pass. "Douglas," said Samson, "I have read each and every one of them cover to cover." "Really?" Douglas scanned the shelves again. That's unbelievable." Samson scowled. "Oh, is that what it is, Mr. Harvard? Unbelievable?" "I'm sorry," Douglas said quickly. "You're a contentious bastard," declared Samson. Douglas's stomach bottomed out, the way it had in high school before his boxing matches. "Samson, Mr. Bonner, I certainly meant no insult." "Ha!" shouted Samson. "Gotcha!" Douglas looked at the Bonner women who wore thin, knowing smirks. "What?" Samson punched Douglas's shoulder. "I was giving you the business, Doug. Had to test your mettle." "Oh." Douglas took a gulp of his wine. "Ha ha," he said weakly. "I shall now rejoin the conversation," said Nicole. "Hell!" Samson pointed his fork at the books. "I'd never read a single one of those things, Doug. They're a priceless collection." "They're heirlooms," said Paulette. "Right, heirlooms." Samson chewed and swallowed. "Nicole reads them. They belong to my ancestor, Vladimir Bonner. He was a prince from the Carpathian Mountains or some crazy bastard place." Samson waved his hand dismissively. "The point is, he was a prince. These are the books." "The point is, the Bonners are royalty," said Nicole. Samson slapped the table. "The gnocchi!" he bellowed. "I made it myself!" He glared around as if expecting dissent. Paulette served the main course, which Douglas had to admit was delicious. He sipped his wine and the conversation mellowed. Samson spoke of common concerns, the mayor, the weather, the stock market. Douglas complimented Samson on the gnocchi. When Samson asked about his Allentown boyhood, Douglas mentioned the Eagle Scout he'd been, but did not mention the chipmunks he'd killed with firecrackers. Paulette asked Douglas about his favorite films, and Douglas answered. Every time Douglas looked at Nicole, she looked right back at him. All in all, Douglas was enjoying himself. The Chardonnay settled lightly in his head, and he found himself wondering random things, like how the Yankees would do this season, or how cold it was outside, or how curvy Nicole had ever emerged from Beanstalk Paulette. The gnocchi plates were cleared. "Well, girls," said Samson, "let's cut to the chase." Paulette placed a snifter of brandy before each person. "Which chase is that?" smiled Douglas. He wiped his mouth with his napkin. "We feel that you should marry Nicole." Douglas sneezed 4 times in a row. Everyone blessed him. "Pardon?" said Douglas. "Paulette and I would like to arrange a marriage between you and our daughter here, our only child." Douglas stared at the Bonners. They were all seated in their chairs, smiling politely. Nicole wore the look that she always wore just before she aced a test. Nobody laughed. "You're kidding, of course," said Douglas. "Oh, no." Samson Bonner sipped his brandy. "I'm not giving you the business, Doug." "He isn't, Mr. Kerchak." Douglas got the boxing feeling in his stomach again. When he was young, he participated in the Friday Night Smokers, weekly events at the Society of Gentlemen Club. The gentlemen were hard-working Allentowners who drank whiskey and played cards on Friday nights. Every weekend, they brought in a select crew of boys from the area high schools. To earn themselves ribeye steak dinners, the boys donned gloves and duked it out in a lighted canvas ring in the center of the club while men drank and cheered. To be picked to be a box smoker was the highest honor an Allentown boy could receive. And Douglas had been chosen 14 times to fight in his weight class. He'd won 12 of those fights, one by knockout, and he'd never had his nose broken. Some nights, even now, just before he slept, Douglas remembered himself in the ring, fighting Heather Angelona's brother, Carmine. Carmine had 10 pounds on him, and he was beating Douglas on points till the third round when Douglas delivered an uppercut that jacked Carmine right off the ground and dropped him unconscious. Men in the room roared like lions. The bell clanged. Douglas remembered cigar smoke in his nose, blood on his own face. Strangely, no blood on Carmine's. Watching Mr. Angelona revive his son with smelling salts, Douglas had wanted, simultaneously, to vomit and to shove his tongue into Heather Angelona's mouth. Douglas shook his head, cleared it. He stood up. "Nicole," he said severely, "what's going on? Is this some joke? Some bizarre family hoax?" "No." Nicole rested her fingertips calmly on the table. "My parents would honestly like you to marry me. So would I." "Please sit down, Douglas," said Paulette. For once, her tone had no levity. Douglas sat. This is nuts. We're just having dinner." Samson Bonner rapped the table with his knuckles. "Hell, son. Paulette and I have been happily married for 25 years, and guess what? My father set the whole thing up. He and Paulette's father were law partners." "My maiden name is Dupompis," explained Paulette. "Right," said Samson, "Dupompis. Anyway, our father saw that Paulette and I would stack up together. Well, we feel that you and Nicole stack up too." Douglas's head was swimming. "You've discussed this? As a family?" "Sure," said Samson. "Every night for a week." Excuse me, Samson, but you don't even know me." "Oh, hell!" Samson swatted the air as if it held gnats. "Nicole knows you. She says you watch a movie every night just like she reads a book every night." "It's adorable," said Paulette. Nicole stared at his student. "Nicole," he said, "you're 19. 20 in September," said Nicole. "We held her back," said Paulette, "in third grade." "Well, 20 then." "She struggled with phonics," said Paulette. "Excuse me." Douglas cleared his throat loudly. The Bonners hushed themselves. "Listen," said Douglas. This has been a lovely meal, but, aren't you all being quite preposterous? As I was trying to point out." "Young man," said Samson, "do you not find Nicole attractive?" Douglas shut his mouth. He kept expecting a game show host to spring out from behind a curtain, but none did. Directly across the table from Douglas sat Nicole in her impossibly black dress, watching him with her relentless blue eyes. For the first time, Douglas honestly considered what it would be like if she were his. He thought of Lillian Marks, the last woman he dated who had adored jazz music. He imagined holding Nicole's hand, driving with her to Montauk in a convertible, the radio playing the bizarre punk bands he knew she liked. He blushed. "Religion's not an issue," blustered Samson. "Nicole assures me that you're high Episcopal, same as we are. She admires your intellect, and you always give her an A. So, what's your problem, Doug?" Douglas pressed the corners of his eyes with his thumbs. "It just seems a little sudden, sir." Douglas snorted. "Douglas," said Paulette, "we're really very impressed with you, especially now that we've met." Douglas sat up very straight. "Yes. Well, as I was trying to say, Nicole's 11 years younger than I am. Doesn't that seem problematic?" "No," said Samson. "I've got 12 years on Paulette." "Mr. Kerchak," said Nicole, "did you know, Mr. Kerchak, that in centuries past a girl was often married and birthing offspring by 14? "Let's not rush into any birthing," chuckled Samson. "This isn't the Middle Ages, Nicole." Douglas swallowed some brandy. "You haven't even been to college." "Well, I'm going, aren't I?" "Of course she is." Paulette sounded offended. "No daughter of mine will be denied an education because of her husband." "Now, hold on," said Douglas. "Hey," growled Samson, "you can have my daughter's hand, Doug, and we'll give you some starting out money, but Princeton's non-negotiable. Don't try to weasel her out of that." "I wasn't no weaseling," said Nicole. Douglas sighed heavily. "I need to use the bathroom," he said. "Well, hell," said Samson. "Who wouldn't?" Paulette pointed to the hallway, third door on the right. Douglas strode quickly out of the room. His mind was a blur. He thought of his unserved, uneaten German cake. He recalled a teaching class he'd once taken where the instructor had told him to watch out for female students and their crushes. Is this what this is, thought Douglas, a crush? The door to the bathroom was slightly ajar, and Douglas was about to push it fully open when he heard a toilet flush from within. Excuse me, Douglas said automatically. He stepped back, surprised. Moments later, the door nudged open, and a black cat stepped out. It stopped at Douglas's feet and looked directly up at him. John Stapleton, whispered Douglas. Meow, said John Stapleton. Douglas stood very still. John Stapleton nibbled briefly at the toe of Douglas's left shoe, as if testing it for taste. Then the cat proceeded down the hall, disappearing into the shadows. This is insane, thought Douglas. This night, this family, this cat, they're all of them certifiable. But the cat seemed like an omen somehow, and as Doug washed his face and hands in the bathroom sink, and as he studied his goofy haircut and took deep weightlifting breaths to compose himself, he thought of Nicole. He thought of the simple silver post earrings she always wore. He recalled the Melville she'd committed to memory, the respect she had for Graham Greene novels, the merciless grip she kept on her stick when she played field hockey. Her favorite film was The Philadelphia Story. Tough favorite to argue against. He'd heard her rail passionately against the death penalty once during an ethics class debate, and he'd seen her hold a faculty member's baby in her arms. I'd like to talk to Nicole alone, said Douglas, when he rejoined the Bonners. Of course he would, said Sampson. Alone, alone. Paulette smiled wearily at Douglas. Use my study. Sampson stood up and shook Douglas's hand. They were alone. Study door was closed. Nicole sat on a daybed, her shoes off, her calves drawn together into one side. Across the room, Douglas sat on the edge of a wooden chair, the top crossbar of which was embossed with a crest. Douglas thought that it might be the Bonner family crest, but he didn't ask. Nicole cracked her knuckles. In a minute, I'm going to start calling you Douglas instead of Mr. Kerchak. Oh, really? Nicole sighed. Mr. Kerchak, please, just listen. I'm going to say some things. Douglas collected his thoughts. Outside the door were a married couple on a green couch, drinking brandy, perhaps petting John Stapleton. In the study with him was a headstrong young woman. Mr. Kerchak, said Nicole, you know that I'm smart, that I can think and read well, like you could when you were 19. But I also know what the world is like, Mr. Kerchak. Douglas watched Nicole. She's serious, he thought. She's deadly serious. I know, said Nicole. I know how long people go in this city without finding someone to love. I'm young, but I understand loneliness. Nicole rubbed her feet. Listen, I know I can be irrational, Douglas. Douglas caught his breath. He felt something in his spine. Fear, maybe. Like tonight, said Nicole, that King Lear business. But here's something you probably don't know. I saw you at the Film Forum last week. Douglas blushed again. They were showing The Gunfighter with Gregory Peck. It was last Tuesday, the 9 p.m. show. I saw it advertised in the paper. I just knew you'd be there, so I went. Douglas tried to remember what he'd worn out that night, what candy he'd brought with him, a flannel shirt, gummy bears. I sat 5 rows behind you and watched your silhouette. I saw you admiring the guy who played the bartender, you know, the guy from On the Waterfront. Douglas closed his eyes. She's right, he thought. She's 19, and she's right. Anyway, whether you marry me or not, this is what I want to tell you, Nicole exhaled. It's no good, Douglas. Douglas kept his eyes closed. He was listening. It's no good, the way you're living. All those weights you lift, all those miles you run, all those movies you see. It isn't right. It's lonely. Douglas looked at her then. He saw her curves and her temples, but something else, too. Something that lived behind her eyes. You're a good teacher and all, But you're just killing time, Douglas, I can tell. Bullshit, thought Douglas. Then he thought, how? How am I killing it? I can tell from the books you assign, the ties you wear, everything. Nicole was not chewing her hair. You're ready, Douglas, for the woman, the one you're supposed to marry. Nicole shrugged just a little. And I think she's me. I've dated some guys, and I know what's around, and, well, I just know what I want. How? Blurted Douglas. His hands trembled on the snifter, so he put it down. He felt like he might weep, but he refused to. How are you saying all this? I just am. Nicole gazed at her teacher. Are you in... Douglas changed phrases. Do you love me? Nicole petted her neck, sipped her brandy. Look, I've got Princeton to go to, and I've got that huge heirloom library out there to read. I'm just saying that you should have a woman with you at the movies, and she should be me. I'm ready for her to be me. Douglas couldn't sit still any longer. He stood up and paced, the way he always had in the locker room before a fight. He wanted to shout or punch or be punched. He wanted something reliable, something he knew the feeling of. He stalked over to Nicole, unsure of what to do. Easy, Douglas. Nicole moved back on the daybed. No, Douglas shook his head, kept pacing. No. Easy, Douglas. You have to tell me something here. I'm 31, and I'm your teacher, for Christ's sake. I mean, is this... Look, answer me now. Nicole. Okay, she whispered. I will. Is this real? I mean, are you in love with me? I'm ready to be, said Nicole. And I mean this as a compliment, but I've got nothing better to do. Douglas stopped pacing. I'm going crazy, he said softly. I'm standing here, solidly, on my own 2 feet, and I'm going crazy. Nicole smiled. She took his hand. Listen, she said, I have the prom in a month, which my cousin Fred's escorting me to, and graduation's 2 weeks after that. It'll be hectic for a bit, but as of the first week of June, I'm prepared to become completely infatuated with you. Douglas laughed out loud at the practicality in her voice. He thought of his mother, of Chiapas and the Mexicans, of the unbroken chain of essays that he'd corrected for the past 6 years. There might be thousands of essays. And there might have been a time in history when all people spoke like Nicole Bonner. I can commute to Princeton, explained Nicole, or else just come back to you on weekends. My family's a little eccentric, and I am too, but, well, there it is. What do you think? Douglas pulled Nicole to her feet. He felt giddy, vicious. He didn't know what he felt. Like an animal, he set his teeth for one last stand. Nicole. His voice was low, almost mean. Yes. I'm only going to ask you this once more. All right? If you're kidding about all this, and you tell me tomorrow that you're kidding, and then I'll... Douglas clenched and unclenched his fists. I'm not kidding, said Nicole. Douglas looked out the window at New York City. He looked back at Nicole. You're sure? Nicole reached up, trailed one hand lightly over Douglas's haircut. Domestic short hair, she whispered. Douglas took both her hands in his. He was beaming. He felt slightly nauseous. All right. All right. If you're serious, then I want you to do something for me. Nicole frowned. No sex till we're hitched. A kiss, maybe. Be quiet and listen. Douglas's voice quavered with pleasure. I don't want you to kiss me. I want you to hit me. What? Douglas couldn't keep the grin, the old triumphant sass off his face. I want you to punch me in the stomach as hard as you can. Nicole stepped away. You're insane. No. Douglas took her by the shoulders, squared her off, facing him. Trust me. If you do this, I'll know that I'll just know. Nicole laughed just a little. You're a freak. Hit me. Nicole angled her head to one side. You're serious? Give me your hand. Nicole held out her right palm. Make a fist. No, like this with your thumb outside. Good. How do you know how to... Shut up and hit me. Douglas sneered at her. Come on. Let's see what you've got. A wicked joy stole over Nicole's face. You better watch it. Hit me. I'll do it, Douglas. Go ahead. Nicole drew her fist back to her hip. Her eyes checked the door that was hiding her parents. She looked at Douglas as if she would erupt with laughter or something else, something he couldn't predict. Come on, punk. Douglas dared her, and that was it. Nicole shot her fist forward and showed him what the both of them were in for.